The most flexible object provided by GeneXus is the web panel object. As we saw in some examples, every web panel offers a web form consisting of a web page that enables us to design and provide different functionalities. In this example, we saw that because a variable was included in the web form, it was enabled for the user to enter a value in it. This specific variable waited for an increase percentage, and then the user pressed the confirm button, and the event associated with it was executed, processing the price increase of all flights and applying the increase percentage typed by the user in the variable. This other web panel we solved is quite similar to the previous one in the sense that it contains variables as well, in this case 2 of them, and also a button. Both variables are presented at runtime, enabled for data entry by user, and when the user presses the confirm button, the associated event is invoked, a procedure to which we send the variables by parameter, which receives them and prints, in PDF format, the attractions whose names are included in the range received. But in addition to defining web panels to accept values in variables, and then using those values to execute a specific action, web panels have the main objective of enabling us to implement and offer users interactive queries to the database. The term interactive refers to the fact that the user may enter, over and over in the web panel page, different values, in variables, and then query data from the database matching those values entered, using them as filters. Afterwards, on the data queried that is shown on a grid, the user may perform different actions. Have we seen something like this before? Why, yes we have, when we saw what the work with for web pattern generated in applying it to transactions. Because the work with for web pattern generates web panels. Now let's define, step by step, a web panel that will implement an interactive query. And then we'll compare it to a work with web panel for web. We will create an object of the web panel type with the name WP Countries. And it will be open in its web form section. We go to the variables section and define 2 variables, one called country name from, based on the attribute country name, and the other called country name to. This one also based on the attribute country name. Now we return to the web form to insert both variables. We select Insert Variable, and when we select them, we will see that they were automatically added in a table with 2 rows and 2 columns, so that the variables are aligned with their titles. So, we know that the variables will be enabled for entering values in them. And since we know that, we must also know that attributes in web panels will always be read-only. This means that they will always be outputs to show their stored contents. Now in the web form, we will insert a grid with the attributes whose data we want to query. So from the toolbox, we select Insert Grid and choose to include CountryID and country name inside. GeneXus will determine for this grid that a specific physical table be navigated because it contains attributes. We say that this grid will have a base table that obviously, given the attributes involved, will be country. Also, if we notice the grid's properties, we will see that we have a grid property called base transaction, which offers the same as in the for each. That is to say, the purpose of this property is that we indicate in it the name of the transaction whose associated physical table we want to navigate. We must know that in web panels, grids with attributes are like a for each. Though we don't write the for each, it's implied. That's why we say that the grid has a base table. What we configure in the base transaction property indicates the base table to GeneXus, and the attributes we may include in the grid are those from the desired base table and its extended table as well. Let's execute the application to view the functioning of this web panel. We execute it with F5. And we see that the variables are enabled for us to enter something in them. We also see that the grid shows all the countries stored in the country physical table. So far, we've done nothing to relate what the user enters in the variables and the navigation that's done in the country physical table. And this is why all countries stored are shown. Now let's go back to GeneXus to define the filters. In the grid's properties, we may define conditions, which is exactly the same as writing where clauses in the for each. So in conditions, we write country name greater than or equal to the variable country name from, and country name less than or equal to the variable country name to. Now let's execute the application again. We press F5. And then insert from A to Z, and we will see that all the countries we've stored are loaded on the grid. Now let's try with A to E, and we will see that fewer countries are loaded. France is no longer loaded, and nor are Uruguay, or the United States, or others. Now let's get back to GeneXus, and notice the navigation list that was generated for the web panel. We can see that there is navigation of the country table, and the filters we define in the grid's conditions are applied. We can also see that the query takes place with the record sorted by CountryID, which is the primary key of the country table. If we want to specify a different order, such as country name, for the countries to appear on the grid in alphabetical order, we have the order property of the grid for that. Let's now configure the country name attribute for the order property. We execute again, set filters, and we can see that the countries included in the range specified are now shown on the grid by country name. Let's take a look again at the navigation list corresponding to this web panel. We now view the sorting by country name, and we also see that we have a greater optimization when the query is executed, because not all records are gone over now to verify their suitability, because they're included in the range requested. Since the query is now made on the table in alphabetical order, it's possible to be positioned on the first country record whose name is greater or equal than the value requested, and then list the consecutive records sorted until we reach the first record that is non-compliant within the range. It's always interesting to notice the navigation list that GeneXus points out for the objects we define, because they enable us to verify the logic that GeneXus has determined, and also to verify if it matches our objective. Okay, now let's execute the work with country. We press F5. This work with country is automatically generated, and we now know it's through a web panel object. We can see that, in this case, there are not two variables to enter the initial and final range, but rather a single variable. But this is something we can do as we wish. The important thing is to associate the knowledge on web panels we're acquiring with what the pattern generated. We can see that, in addition to being attractive and generated fast with just one click upon applying the pattern, this web panel is quite complete in the sense that, apart from offering the possibility of filtering and querying certain countries, it also enables us to edit or delete countries, as well as the possibility to physically insert a new country. It's possible to define all that as well, and we will see how it's done. But our suggestion is to benefit from using the work with pattern. In this case, we refer to the for web pattern, but this is also applicable to the pattern for smart devices, in order to gain in productivity when we need to obtain this type of interactive queries in standard format. We consider it important to be knowledgeable of what the work with pattern generates, in addition to the GeneXus web panel object. And there are several reasons for this. The first because we might be requested to provide queries or uses that may be solved with web panels, but not exactly what's provided by the work with for web pattern. And secondly, in order to open a web panel object generated automatically by the pattern and understand and know its parts. So let's continue with the definition of the web panel we started to implement. In the grid, we will add an image to appear for each line, with the purpose of enabling the user to press the image towards a line when the addition of that country's data is required. Let's define a new variable and name it update image. And we add it as column in the grid. We click on the grid, right-click, Columns, Add, and select the variable. We transfer the variable so that it's located at the end, and we remove the column's title. The image we want to load in the variable must be inserted in the knowledge base. One way to go about this is to go to Customization, select Images, and this lists all images currently stored in the KB. Let's choose to insert a new one. We want to load it from a file. We select it. We leave its name update and save. Now we have to assign the image to the variable. The most appropriate place to do this assignment is the start event, because it's the first event executed when the web panel is opened in runtime, and it's also the event that's used to define initializations. So inside the start event, we type ampersand, select the update image variable, dot, select the method, from image, and pass as parameter the name of the image in the knowledge base, which is update. We press F5 to view the result of what we've just defined. We execute our web panel, and we can view the image on each line. What we need to do now is associate an action with the image. We want that the country transaction be opened upon the users clicking on it, showing the data of that line's country. Specifically, the form must be in edit mode so that the user may modify the data of the record shown and save changes made. So let's program the click event associated with the update image variable. In the events section of the web panel, we place the cursor under the start event and select Insert Event. This dialog shows all controls included in the form, and for each of them, the events that may be executed. So we put the update image in place, and from all events possible. Right now, we'll choose click. The syntax that defines the event is inserted, and now we move on to codify what we need inside. We select Insert, Object, and insert the country transaction, which is the one we want to invoke. But we said that we wanted the transaction to open up in edit mode, with the country in question instanced. So, we must pass to the transaction by parameter the FixXTestUpd, which stands for update, so GeneXus can recognize it and understand that it has to open the transaction in edit mode. And the second parameter we must send to the transaction is the line's country identifier, CountryID. And we save. Now let's go to the country transaction because we must receive these parameters by declaring a parm rule in the rules section. And let's note that there's already a declared parm rule, which is precisely the one we were about to declare. But why is it already defined? Because the work with for web pattern did it when we applied it to this transaction. Note that the first parameter is a variable called mode. It's preceded by the in operator, indicating that it's an input parameter. Something very important to point out is that in all transactions, the mode is predefined already, and it's used only to be received as parameter because its function is to automatically and exclusively recognize values of the character type. INS is the insert mode, UPD is the update mode, DLT is the delete mode, and DSP is the display mode. Let's now look at the second parameter. It's also an input variable, CountryID. And this rule defines that the value received in the variable be assigned to the attribute CountryID. So it's like a filter reset, provided that the variable received does not have a void value. And the only case we send with no value for this parameter is when we want to call the transaction to insert a new record. Because if we want to edit or delete, we must send the primary key of the record we want to edit or delete. So, we saw the country transaction is being invoked from our WP Countries web panel and also from the Work With Countries web panel. And obviously, we can use the parm rule defined for the pattern because we're learning more about web panels and exercising typical practices, quickly generated by the pattern. And we're seeing how they're defined in detail. We press F5, select our web panel, indicate a range, and let's modify United States. We double-click on the image, and we'll edit the name, USA, and save. And we see that the grid is loaded again with the query, showing the change we just made. Let's name it again, United States. This implementation we've defined, offering the ability to edit the country data, may be repeated to implement the deletion as well. We would have to define another variable, add it to the grid, and assign to it a representative image. And in the click event of the variable, we would have to place the same invocation to the country transaction. The only difference being, instead of sending the UPD parameter to the transaction, we would be sending DLT. Because in the transaction, the parameter received in the mode variable would understand that, and it would open the transaction to offer the ability to delete the record whose primary key has been received. Now let's add a button in the web form offering the ability of inserting a new country, as offered by the Work With Countries generated automatically. We drag a button here from the toolbox, and we may associate it to an image. But in this case, we will change the button's caption and use Insert Country. We double-click on the button, and by default, it has the enter event associated with it. All buttons added have, by default, the enter event associated to them. But we will create a new event, a user event associated with this button. So we go back to the form, and from the button's properties, in the onClick event property, we select New, and here we put the name of the new user event. And we will call it Insert Country. So, what should happen when we press this button and the associated event is executed? The country transaction should be opened to offer the form ready for a new entry. So, we must invoke the country transaction, we double-click, and we see the name of the event we defined, and we select Insert Object, and then select the country transaction, and open and close parentheses. The first parameter we send to the transaction is INS, and the second parameter will be a 0, because in this case, we want to complete the expected parameter with void. We do not have a value to send because it will be auto-numbered when the country's data is entered and confirmed. We press F5 to test this new functionality we just added. We execute our web panel, press the New button, and we will see that the country transaction opens up, ready for us to make an entry. Now let's register Italy. We write Italy, and for city we write Rome. Now let's suppose there's a requirement to view, for each country, the number of cities recorded. We don't have this data in an attribute, so we'll define a new variable, call it cities quantity, and add it to the grid as a column. Right-click, Columns, Add, select the cities quantity variable, and move it to the place we want it to appear in the grid. Now let's think. How can we solve that, for each line loaded with a country from the country table, the number of cities in it be calculated and shown? Let's go to the Events section, and notice this event characteristic of web panels, the load event. We will explain the number of times and when this event is executed depending on each case. Since this web panel has only one grid, which has base table, that is country, the load event will be executed as many times as there are lines with countries loaded in the grid. To be exact, we should know that it will be executed once for each record in the navigated table, just prior to loading each record as a line on the grid. This means that, since this event will be executed for each line in the grid, immediately prior to showing the values of attributes on the line, we can, at this very moment, assign to the cities quantity variable the result of an inline formula that will count the cities in the country that is about to be loaded. And we will be in time for this count to be shown. In previous videos, we've learned that this formula determines the physical table to be navigated by the attributes appearing inside the parentheses. So the formula will count in the country city table, but not all cities recorded, regardless of the country, because the load event is being executed n times while the country table is navigated. So there is a navigation done in the context where we're located. Country and country city have the CountryID attribute in common. So in the load event, we will have one navigated country record every time, and having its CountryID, an automatic filter will be applied when cities are counted. This filter will indicate that the cities counted be those of the CountryID being navigated and about to be loaded as line. Let's then see this result in runtime. We press F5. We indicate the range, show all countries, and in fact, we see the number of cities for each country. Lastly, we make these changes to the GX server.